Welcome all hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters to the only fish and wildlife conservation podcast that goes behind the scenes of the business of conservation, the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Our podcast is hosted by John Gassett from the Wildlife Management Institute and Scott Lavin from Tyee Resources. John and Scott will talk with experts from all sectors of the conservation arena about their passion for conserving the great outdoors. So please welcome our host of the Connecting with Conservation podcast, John and Scott.
John Gassett here, Connecting with Conservation, doing our next podcast, and I have my co-host here, Scott Lavin, with me from Arizona, and a special guest from Nebraska Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Jeff Rawlinson. Jeff, well, first of all, Scott, why don't you talk? You haven't been on you've been as a guest on one of our shows, but you've not co-hosted yet. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what your experience is.
So I'm a former outdoor industry business manager. Was involved in product sales for a regional size retailer, and started talking to state wildlife agencies to learn more about how to connect with my customers, and started drinking the Kool-Aid because they taught me things that you don't learn in business, and that I didn't learn recreating out on the landscape either. So it's a contagious community. And I learned a story that really needed to be told that wasn't being told effectively, and it's changed my career.
Well, and it really sums up why we're doing this Connecting Conservation podcast, to talk about, to relay the message that how conservation is funded, how hunters and anglers and shooters buy licenses and equipment and shells and fishing equipment and boat gas, and all that goes back into paying for conservation, which benefits everybody, not just the people participating. So, Jeff, welcome on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, what your background is.
Well, my background is I'm the Assistant Division Administrator at Game and Parks Commission. I oversee the hunter education, hunter outreach, shooting sports, range development programs for the agency. I've been involved in the R3 movement since I got here, probably about 26 years ago. Formerly, trained as a biologist and all that kind of stuff at the University of Nebraska. But this is the field I've been working in, education and the R3 movement for quite some time now.
Cool. And when you say R3, of course, we do that several times in our podcast, but recruitment, retention, reactivation of new participants, whether they're hunters, anglers, boaters.
Correct. They're the back, obviously our participants are the backbone of the funding model, right? And so it's imperative that we have, not only is it just good for families, good for people, quality of life, making memories, but it's imperative that we have people in that funding model constantly funding conservation.
Well, no, that is good for the manufacturers of taxable products too. Even though they have to pay that 10 or 11% tax, they get the benefit of more, especially when that money goes to an R3 program, of recruiting more and more of their customers, because hunters have to buy shells and have to buy firearms. Fishermen have to buy, anglers have to buy equipment, fishing equipment to fish with. So it's a win-win for everyone. But tell us a little bit. So you said 25 years in R3, and that makes you one of the pioneers then, because 25 years ago we were hardly talking about
R3. We weren't
R3.
talking about R3 26 years ago. We were talking about education. Yeah, and predominantly hunter education. Hunter education is probably the original R3 program, if you will, in terms of programs. Now, of course, a lot of things agencies were doing at the time would be considered R3 today. We just didn't call it that. But lo and behold, we started doing in education. Prime example, I remember our director, Rex Amack, who was the director when I took over, came in and he wanted to build an education plan. Now, he was referring to an R3 plan, but we didn't have that jargon. But as we started making the plan, and this was kind of later in my career even, but this was like 2004 or 5 we started working on this, or 5 or 6, and it became obvious that what we're trying to do is recruit new hunters and anglers and shooters and whatnot. We called it the RDR plan, the Recruitment, Development, and Retention Plan for Nebraska. Yeah, and now we were naive enough to think we could create a 20-year plan. I would never create another 20-year plan for anything. But
a 3-year plan.
Yeah, 3 to 5 at the most. But we set out to try to create this big plan. I don't think there were too many plans, if any, at the time. We had nothing to draw from. We had very little science, very little research. And so I remember Alicia Harden. She's the wildlife chief for our agency now. She and I, at the time, were kind of spearheading this, along with Jim Swenson, who's our deputy director now. And we were doing all kinds of reviews, trying to find out what research is available. Turned out there wasn't much research. DJ Case there was some research I think that they had on the landscape, or just put on the landscape. We had pockets here and there, but just wasn't very much out there on the human dimension side when it came to our hunters and our anglers and our shooting sports enthusiasts. So our new plan that we created just a couple of years ago, it's kind of an update of the old one. A lot more research, a lot more data-driven, a lot more research.
Good deal. Good deal. Well, so a lot of things have happened, as this evolution of R3 has occurred. One of which is there is now some more money available. So, for example, some of the excise tax money flows through the multi-state grant program, and that used to be things like marketing and outreach, and all the components of R3 weren't allowed. And about 3 or 4 years ago, of course, we got that law changed, and now there's a new pot of money out there that's based on the excise tax that's really focused hardcore on that R3 effort.
And that's been critical. It really has, because, back 20-some years ago, the R3 community hadn't been really built yet, right? We didn't have the aggressive R3 committees that we have in the Northeast, the Southeast, the Midwest, the Western. And so it would have been very difficult for the regions to utilize those funds 20 years ago. Today, we have this new pot of federal funding, and we have these robust, active committees, R3 committees across the country. So it was just a perfect timing, because the committees, they're run by skilled people who have a lot of information, a lot of research, a lot of experience in the R3 world. They know what the needs are. We've learned that the needs are oftentimes regional, if not national, and there was very little effort being done to work on those needs. And so all of a sudden we have this pot of money, and now the Western, the Midwestern, we're all just putting together all these grants for meeting the needs that we have gone unanswered for a lot of years, that are helping everybody, regionally and nationally. And so these have been really well received by the R3 community, and really well focused, whereas the foot soldiers on the ground having access to those funds, the R3 committees, the chairs, that's been a perfect storm.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that. You identified that it was mainly education back those days, and I think that's an important note for people to understand the journey here. That's kind of passive recruitment. So you give somebody the facts, and I was a product of this. I was late to hunting. I always wanted to hunt. My dad passed away. I didn't get the opportunity to hunt. Read the manual, went to hunter ed. Like so many people these days, still didn't feel comfortable, wasn't ready, right? And we were all in a meeting earlier today that talked about the complexity of hunting regulations, and most people conscientious. This is something that business does really good at, in helping to remove barriers to have people make a purchasing decision. What are, in your tenure, what are some things that you have done to transition to more active recruitment to make it simpler for the public to adapt such, going outside in the outdoors and recreating by yourself? You don't learn how to do that in an hour-long class, right?
No, you don't. And let me take that further back and kind of come at this a little bit more from the academic side. When we started doing this, we just created programs that we felt were necessary, that we had, this is what we want to do, right? We want to teach about this, what about that. And, so we learned some things, a lot from those efforts, just like every effort. Every profession has to evolve, and ours was no different. Our wildlife management today isn't the same as it was 50 years ago. Thank God it evolved, right? And our biologists are the best in the world, but they had to continue to evolve. We're no different with profession. And but we were doing a lot of these things, and we realized that, we got to figure out, why this is. In some areas it was working, in some areas it wasn't working, i.e. we weren't getting the outcomes that we had desired. And lo and behold, we started doing a little more research. A gentleman by the name of Matt Dunphy came along with Wildlife Management Institute and says, hey, there's some models out there that I think are applicable to all of this. And we started looking at getting some research on the books, and lo and behold, we realized that, hey, we need to target our programs to the customer. And one thing that we started utilizing, something very basic, but the outdoor recreation adoption model was something that we had no idea had existed. We had an idea of how people kind of progress, but we didn't have the science behind it. But once we learned about the model and how to use it, it was easy for us to say, we're not tailoring our programs. We need to tailor our programs to a specific audience. We need to know where they're at on their journey. Everybody's on a journey. I mean, it doesn't matter what activity you take on. You're on a journey in life, and that activity is part of it. And you're somewhere on that journey with respect to that activity. It doesn't matter what sport you're in. And so when we looked at it from that standpoint, we started changing our programs, not just Nebraska, but nationally. Everybody started kind of changing their programs or identifying gaps in their programs. Hey, I can take a person to this stage with my program, but I'm not getting them to the continuation without support stage. So I need to find a partner who can help fill this gap. It's a different way of thinking, right? But once we started thinking like that, it's helped quite a bit. And so we're doing a lot more of using some of the human dimensions work that's been going on over the last 10, 15 years to better target our programs, better understand the expectations that can come from these programs, measuring the results of those programs, and identifying where those gaps are so that we can help people on every step of their journey until they're if they want to be, in like us in terms of hunting without support, i.e. I can go out hunting and I don't need anybody necessarily to help me, then we want to help get them there. We have the science now that helps us do that. Scalability isn't always our friend. That's always a challenge, but we certainly know how to create hunters and anglers and shooting sports enthusiasts today.
A large portion of our audience are outdoor recreation industry professionals, many of them from the commercial side of the business. And I always like to tie it back to business. You go into a store, you make a purchase, a lot of times there's a customer survey. They're doing the same thing. They want to make sure that they're doing the right things that reinforce those behaviors, keep those customers coming back. And, I've been here less than half the time that you've been in your tenure, but I've seen that focus on engaging with the public and trying to create the experiences that they're looking for on the terms and on the ground that they're looking to pursue them on. So I think that the industry's come a long way, and again, you being one of the original,
the OGs.
Yeah, the
old
original
guard.
gangsters
The old
of
guard.
building the R3 effort.
So you funny you mention that because this is a fascinating subject for me. But when Dunphy did that work with Bob Byrne back the evaluation process, they found 420 programs across the country, distinct programs to do hunter recruitment, and they found almost none of them had any metrics associated with them. And that's been a big shift in R3 is, now we're doing programs to recruit folks, but we have metrics, we have measures, which is a common business practice, not necessarily common government practice, but now government agencies are starting to incorporate those metrics. So
They really are.
Yeah, what are y'all seeing as far as some successes on those types of programs or failures?
Yeah, both. I mean, certainly both. I think that the metrics that we're using today far different than what we did before. 20 years ago, it was smiling faces and happy kids, right? And everybody was like, "Man, that was great." Yeah, and you walk away just feeling so good about yourself, and what you've accomplished with the kids and whatnot. And we still have a lot of programs targeting kids, but we've now learned models that work and that weren't necessarily the models that we used 20-some years ago. We're targeting adults more than we ever have before. Obviously, participation rates. You look at adult female participation rates, highest levels they've ever been when it comes to hunting and shooting sports. I mean, it's just they are absolutely increasing at an increasing rate, and that's something that we want to help with. And so we're I'd say targeting, but we're trying to provide the needs that those ladies might have, which is very different than what males might have or kids might have and whatnot. And so the metrics that we're using today are very outcome based, and we know the difference now between outputs and outcomes. Gone hopefully are the days that anybody just measures, did people have fun at the workshop? Would they recommend it to a friend? And do they learn something? And do they intend to come back and do this again? Those are great measurements, by the way. Those are things we were measuring 25 years ago. It's just, now we got to take it a little bit further and determine, are they doing these things, and if not, what's missing? Case in point, the Becoming an Outdoors Woman program. I'm a huge advocate for that program. It's been in Nebraska for 30 a little over 30 years, I think now. And it's a great program, reaching adult women. I think it's one of the reasons why we've had such an increase in adult women, all these programs, all these years across the country. But when we started surveying the ladies from the program, we started learning that, some were moving on, but a lot weren't. Now, we learned about ripple effects, too, and that's something that has been huge with our BOW program. This lady may not be hunting or fishing or shooting on her own, but we found she's taking her kids and doing those things. Or she and her spouse are now going out and doing these things with the kids or whatever. But she's not as interested as she might have thought she was maybe, but the kids are learning about it. Other family members, that's a huge win that we have a hard time measuring. So I always want to suggest that you try to measure those things because sometimes they can be huge. But in the evaluation, in our metrics, we started learning that there are gaps. And our BOW coordinator, she responded with a new program effort called the BOW Cohort Program, which is now getting these ladies out hunting with other ladies. No, not a mentoring situation. Getting these ladies together, it's finding that social support that they told us they were missing, and giving them opportunities. She's out ahead, removing barriers, and that cohort group just continues to grow and grow. And more ladies are jumping in, and because they're just like guys, they want to go out and hunt and with camaraderie, with friends, and with like-minded people.
Well, that's a good point too, and with a hunter adoption model that that we've talked about, that's a years-long process. It's hard to measure that with a nose count in a classroom. It
really is. What a person has to do is just be honest about what you're measuring and where your program lies on that model, so that you can look for those gaps, and then you can just be honest with yourself. We did a training last week at the R3 Symposium in Mobile, Alabama, which was fairly well attended. It was a good group of folks. And, in that training, we used the ORAM, or the adoption model, to show, here's your gaps, and it's okay to have gaps. Not every program, and I'm going to say this because I want people to understand, not every program needs to have everything a person needs from the awareness stage all the way to the continuation without support. In fact, oftentimes, that may not be, economically viable, right? And so that's where I think sometimes we lose scalability again, because we're trying to do everything, and we can only do everything for a small number of people. So recognizing where it likely impacts, and most of our programs are at that awareness interest trial stage. That's where most of our true recruitment, giving people a one-time trial, but we know that's not enough now, and so it's a matter of, knowing that and being honest about who can help you get those people to the next stage and the next stage, so that their journey is complete. Their needs are realized, which certainly are in line with the industry's needs and our needs, the State Fish and Wildlife Agency as well. We just have to figure out ways to make sure they get there on that journey.
One of the things I've seen become more prevalent in the content of these, R3 events. They're often outside. They're actually in the pursuit of game. They're not in a classroom. But they do have messaging on the conservation model and how it's funded, which was completely absent probably more than a decade ago, right? And I think that the thing our industry partners need to realize is the more successful and more sophisticated these events become, they're going to create people who are more avid. And the people who are avid, and this, one, they're buying hunting and fishing licenses more frequently, more discipline, and two, they're consuming more products. All right, they're having to buy more equipment. They're getting more sophisticated in their outdoor recreation, and so this is a win-win for everybody.
It really is, and it goes back to that ripple effect where we can say, hey, look, license measurement is but one measurement, but what the industry folks in the industry might say is good isn't necessarily just that measurement, right? And what we say in Fish and Wildlife may not just be that measurement as well. So yes, all those other some things are intangible. We can't easily measure them, but they're happening because this lady went to this event and found a pathway that she's comfortable on, or this kid is in a program that will forever be an outdoor kid, right? And they'll forever understand that connection. And we are doing that much more today than ever before. I'm a big North American model fan. I think it's one of the greatest untold stories, unfortunately, the world's ever known. And when you look at the model, and you look, it's not really a model, but when you look at our North American model and you look at the history of it, if it doesn't make you just patriotic, passionate, man, there's something wrong with you, right? Because it is, and that connection to industry, how vital that is. To be a fly on the wall in 1936 and 37, when a lot of these changes, were happening, and of course the Pittman-Robertson Act in 37 was probably one of the most prominent changes that impacted our model, certainly impacted industry and state fish and wildlife agencies. They would never be the same again once that act passed, and it's one of the most phenomenal acts Congress has ever passed, in my opinion, because with that excise tax comes the basis for just about all the things that we do in fish and game management across the country, and of course the shooting sports industry being so connected in that element as well. In fact, of course, we learned the last couple of years, the shooting sports industry and the shooting sports folks who don't hunt but go out and shoot recreationally on a consistent basis are carrying the lion's share of those federal funds now, and so in the future, if there's something I think we need to focus on a little bit more is, yes, we've made that connection on the hunting side, but I think there's a lot of folks out there on the recreational shooter side who don't know that connection yet, and even hunters, we need to continue to make that connection. But the shooting folks side, the shooting sports side, need to better understand that connection as well, because when they've learned about it, as recent research suggests, they're very supportive of it. That's cool. I'm glad I'm supporting that.
Well, I was going to say the ripple effect you talked about too, as far as relating it back to industries. We try to bring folks in, get them in the process of the hunter adoption model, knowing that some are going to drop out. But you have sort of different levels of dropping out. So let's say they can't get past the point of taking an animal, but they like the shooting part of it. So maybe they become recreational shooters and support the program, but they're not a hunter. So, they don't benefit as much to the agency, but they do still provide the excise tax. And you have some that decide this is just not for me. But in that process, they've learned about locally sourced protein. They've learned about, the fact that all this money helps provide clean water, clean air, a healthy environment. There's public places they can go hike and bird watch and photograph. And while they're not contributing cash-wise by not buying a license or paying excise tax, there's still a support for the activities. In other words, they may be supportive of private firearms ownership and all the battles, all the things that entails. They support the fact that there may be a WMA that's going in near them, and rather than seeing it as a nuisance because it's taking up land, here's an opportunity to have closer to home. So there's a lot of support we get even from the people that don't make it through the hunter adoption model.
And again, some of those are intangibles that we don't always measure, but when we do measure, we find that that's happening, right? We see that that's happening, and intangibles like that, like mom coming out to a BOW program, and maybe the hunting and fishing and shooting isn't necessarily for her, but I've heard this so many times again, time and time again. But now I'm more comfortable my kids getting involved in this because they want to learn to shoot or they want to start hunting, and now it's not such a black box to mom. She's comfortable with it. She's learned about it. She knows the history behind it now. She knows the connection to wildlife conservation. She knows safety principles, and so now she's a little more comfortable with those kids getting out and doing those things. And so if we do a database search, we won't find her in there, and we might look at that and say, yeah, that was a fail, right? We didn't, the ROI wasn't there. And in a strict business model, which we're not. Certainly in fish and wildlife, we're not a business, but we certainly have business principles that we operate under. And in a strict business model, you'd say, well, that was a loss on the investment. But then you go back and learn what's going on behind the scenes, and you say, we gained 3 in that family for the one person who came and we thought it was a loss. And that's happening all the time. And so there's so much going on that's supporting the model, supporting our industry, supporting our agencies, that this connection is one that's just long may it always be, because it's vital. It is absolutely vital. It's just cool to watch those people change at a program or a series of programs, and to walk away going, there's another supporter, or there's another person who is actually going to be paying into the model, or there's another life we just changed forever in a positive light. And there's so many things that are happening now. We talked about scalability earlier. There's so many things now that are happening. We're starting to see more scale. Our trap shooting programs across the country are as robust as they've ever been. Thousands of kids. And then you take something like NASP, National Archery in the Schools program, 1.3 million kids a year. You can't find scale. I mean, that's scale. That is huge. And reaching every kid in the classroom, not just the kids who want to show up and shoot that day, but every kid in the classroom. So you're talking now programs, incredible scalability. And at the end of the day, let's not forget, at the end of the day, of all these things we can measure, we're also we're also changing these kids' lives. We're changing these adults' lives. We're making their lives infinitely better because they picked up a bow and arrow, or they picked up a shotgun on the trap range, or they went on a mentored hunt, and it opened up a whole new world to them. Man, what a cool thing to be a part of.
I got to put you on the spot because I lived what you said. You talked about the North American model being the greatest story never told. It was never told to me. I was selling firearms, selling hunting licenses every day. I could have sold a lot more with that story, right? But it's a long story. You don't have that story, at an outreach booth at an event when you're talking to the pedestrians, right?
To do it right, it's a long discussion.
So, have you cracked that code anyway? How do you?
I do a lot of talks on it. Yeah.
How do you break that out to somebody? Because you have to have a relationship with somebody where you're visiting with them a couple times. You can't dump 4 hours of data and history on them all at once, right?
I had an incredible role model. I got to meet and get to know Jim Posowitz of the Ryan Institute, biologist out of Montana, and who had done a lot of research, wrote several books, and I got to pick his brain. In fact, he had given me all of his notes and on this that he had, the write-up that he had, and I just studied, and then I started getting more books and learning. And I just became enthralled in the story. And I thought, people need to hear this. And so I started doing some talks and workshops, and always it's well received because, certainly it's a history thing. You got to love your history, and most people like history, and you can always make history exciting. But there's war, there's politics, there's people behaving badly, people behaving greatly at their best, right? And there's learning about 75, 80 years ago now, learning about decisions that were made, and one of the things that I think is just incredibly interesting, how close we came to that, like Pittman Robertson. That's not the whole story of the model, but it's a key piece. We all agree there, the funding portion of the model, how close that came to not happening. And what happened, what bill it was piggybacked on, and what happened. And I always tell people, I have a joking comment that you owe the funding of the North American model to the unwed mothers of the 1930s. And when people hear that, what do you mean by that? Well, because at the time bills had, the bills are always piggybacked with another bill, and this one was piggybacked on a milk and cheese bill, which was a milk and cheese bill for unwed mothers at the time. Of course, everything in the 1930s, nobody had anything, right? People needed help, and this was on that piggybacked on the bill, and it wasn't going anywhere. And so I think it was Senator Key Pittman that got on the phone and started calling moms clubs all across the country, saying, "Hey, this bill isn't going anywhere. You need to get on the phone and start calling your representatives." And so these moms clubs all across the country started doing that, and boy, they came in force. And here goes the greatest funding model of conservation that the world, not just this country, the world has ever seen in 1937. So phenomenal story, and that's just a small part of it, but a phenomenal story.
Yeah, almost $1 billion a year in revenue to states.
It really is.
Talking about that model, you've hit on two things that because there's always misconceptions, as there is with anything, but I do a lot of talks on the North American model too, and I constantly have to remind people that it is not a prescriptive model. It's not telling us what to do going forward. It's a retrospective, historical look at what happened since conservation became a modern thing. So it includes a lot of things that we did wrong and cast aside. So that's one of the things that people, even in our profession, get hung up on is that we got to follow the North American model. It's like, well, to do that, we actually ought to write a prescriptive model that are a set of guidelines of here's how we should do things that include things like R3 and marketing and outreach and things that historically agencies haven't done. But the other one, too, is on the excise tax, and I love to hear this. They said, sportsmen and women went to Congress and demanded to be taxed. The tax was already on those firearms, and everybody says nobody ever has gone to Congress and said, make me give you more money. Sorry, it just doesn't happen.
No.
But they redirected a tax that was going to expire.
But here's what I think is significant about that. Who had probably the most to lose out of that, and that probably was the firearm industry, because this tax was going to sunset, and it wasn't like they were probably going to charge less after that. That was going to be money made. It was going to make 10% more on their every rifle and shotgun sold, but the industry had the wherewithal to say, guys, this is good for our industry, not just today, but 75, 100 years from now. This is going to be good, important for. Thank God they had the wherewithal to do that, because the easy move, 1937, everybody, nobody's got anything. The easy move is just to say, yeah, let's let that thing sunset. They didn't do it. They didn't take the easy way out. And look where we're at today. Greatest funding model for conservation world's ever known.
Even adjusted for for time, do you think any of those industry CEOs in 37 would ever thought there was $1 billion a year in taxes?
No, I don't think they could have seen how
there was
how
no
big,
way.
How big
I don't
this
think
became.
they knew what $1 billion was back
No,
then.
no. Yeah, but even adjusted back for the price then, they still had no idea that it was going to be that amount of money.
Well, and how the industry's changed. Back then, probably just about large percentage of every firearm sold was a hunting rifle or a hunting shotgun. I mean, that was what firearms were being used for. Today, you have all that. I mean, millions of rounds being fired every year by hunters. Don't get me wrong. But now the robust recreational shooter has come up over the last 50 years, just adding incredibly to that model. And so what are state fish and wildlife agencies doing? Well, they realize that industry needs the support just like every other industry does. And so we build ranges with some of those funds. We do shooting sports classes. We get people involved in different recreational shooting opportunities, shooting sports opportunities, and become take an educational role with the public in this regard. And so it's just it couldn't be much more of a match made in heaven, right? If you were an industry and had all these people out there doing all this work on your behalf to get more customers, that's a great thing. On the other side, we know it's good for society, it's wholesome for people to hunting and fishing and shooting and all that. So those are great things. Plus, of course, we need them in the conservation effort, and I'd call it a movement still, maybe the conservation movement. The average citizen who participates is the most critical element still.
When you think about the timing issue, in 37, we're in the Depression. It's, people didn't do recreational shooting. You ever wonder where their next meal was coming from? You didn't go burn 22 shells or shotgun shells playing. You use those for food.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
there wasn't a lot of that.
It's a different world now.
Yeah, there much is, and our model continues to evolve. It's going to be interesting as it evolves in the future. But the challenge, and I always say this, the challenge is to keep the people on board. I say this because I was at a dinner here a few years ago. I'll never forget one of the gentlemen who runs a pheasant hunting operation in Nebraska, and he had been to Africa, and he made the comment at this dinner about the African model of conservation and how much better it was than the one in the United States here, and how we ought to think about that model. And I called him on it because it really borderline offended me. And I said, bottom line, I said, be proud of what we have, because a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into this, the evolution of this effort over time. But I asked him, I said, what percentage of the people in most of these other countries where these models are so great actually participate in the conservation effort? They don't hunt, they don't fish, can't afford to. In Africa, the prime example of a model is they can't afford to hunt those animals because they got to have somebody else coming in and pay for those animals, right? And so it doesn't have the same value as the heritage that we grew up with, where there's a lot of value, not just what somebody's willing to pay to hunt it, but there's a lot of value to those wildlife. Our challenge continues to be to bring the public along on this conservation journey as our model evolves. Have the public continue to be involved, not just as paying customers or contributing through taxes, but also contributing through the passion that everybody in this room has, that they want to make sure that they conserve wildlife. They want to make sure that we have wild places with wild things roaming in them for an infinite amount of time. I think that's one of the greatest things that separates this country from every other country. We have those things. We didn't at the turn of the century, when we had the opportunity the 1900s. We had the opportunity to go down the same road as every other country before us, and we didn't. And that says volumes for this country.
Well, our history is, we fought a little war in the late 1700s over the fact that these things don't belong to the king; they belong to the people.
That's right. And again, if we could do that differently, we probably would, because when we fought that little war in starting in 1776 that most people are familiar with, called Revolutionary War, and when we won our independence from the King of England, it wasn't with the people of England, it was with the King of England, between the King of England and the people of the colonies. When we won that war, everything in this country became belonging to the states. Well, who are the states? States of the people. It became belonging to the people. Very different than any other country, and that's certainly worth pointing out. Here in the United States, people own the wildlife. That belongs to everybody. Very different than most countries. But the one thing we didn't do, probably what we should have done, is we didn't come up with laws on how we would govern and manage that. It took to the middle of the 1800s before we really realized that, hey, this is a public trust. This needs to be managed for the good of the public in a way that will have value long into the future.
Well, that's something, I haven't been doing this half as long as you two have, but we talk about the hunting heritage, and that's a real thing that really kind of struck me in the face when I got into this. I mean, that's a tangible thing. And when you teach youth at these mentored camps about the role of conservation and the fact that they're proud to share their hunter ed card, they're proud to they can't wait to show their
it's part
license.
of their culture, their heritage. Absolutely,
it's absolutely huge.
Rite of passage for some kids, right?
Yeah.
I got my hunter ed card here. I'm part of the club, part of the team.
It's funny that you mentioned the African. The guy mentioned the African experience, and I've hunted there as well, and I actually made this comment on a podcast the other day on Podcast and Blast that, the difference between us, the way we manage wildlife, and the countries in Africa manage wildlife is we have the luxury of picking our model. We can pick the model we have, the public trust model. We can pick the model that Africa has, privately owned wildlife managed by private landowners, and hunters go and pay a fee. And in some cases, a state like Texas, they sort of got a hybrid of that. They do both. But the difference is we're a very wealthy country. South Africa, for example, is a very poor country, and they don't have an excise tax. They don't really have a licensing system like we have in our state. So they don't have a funding source other than private landowners who have money that can buy wildlife and allow hunting opportunities. So
that's a good distinction.
Yeah.
Be thankful that we're in a country where we don't have to make that decision, because you really can't point to the people there in South Africa and say that's a bad decision, because for their here and now,
it works for them.
It works for them.
Exactly.
In perpetuity, it'll be interesting to see how things go, but it works for them for now, and we really need to be thankful. And again, it's from the decisions made in the 1800s and 1900s that we have the ability to say, hey, this is the model of conservation that we're prescribed to here in the United States, because there's no question it's a better model for us, for the United States, and for long term. But there's a lot of curves in the road still. It isn't like this model's on a path toward just greatness. It's going to take good men and women, as it always had, to continue to care for a long, long time to come, and to make good decisions. We have incredible leaders in the conservation community today. It's going to take those incredible leaders to keep our model moving the direction it needs to, because there's always diversions, there's always changes to where a model, things can go, actions can evolve, and but at the end of the day, we got to think of that, kind of what Teddy Roosevelt said, for the greatest number, for the longest period of time, and how do we maintain that? Because truly, it's a model, and I've just always say this because it's so significant of our model. It truly is a model where kid in Lincoln, Nebraska, can grow up hunting and fishing and shooting, and still today, I can drive 15 minutes and be out in the field in a deer stand. What other country in the world can say that?
For less than most other outdoor activity, or organized outdoor activities.
It doesn't cost much.
Play a round of golf. It costs as much. You can hunt all year for what one round of golf costs.
I'm the average kid in Lincoln, Nebraska, right? I'm not wealthy. I'm certainly not unable to provide, but I'm certainly not wealthy. The average person, and I think that's phenomenal that statement can be made, because you go to any other countries, there's hunting, but it's not the average person.
Something I never get tired of pointing out. You think about those leaders back then really need to take a bow, because they didn't have Google Earth, they didn't have tech, they didn't have computers,
no internet,
right? No satellite coverage, right? Yeah. But they knew human nature. They saw what was happening from the back of a train, and they knew that we were messing this up, and if we didn't stop it, there wouldn't have been anything left for you and I to hunt now, right? And our model preserves generation after generation of wildlife, so that there's opportunity for generation after generation of human participation. And that just blows the vision that those folks had to have back then without the resources that we have now.
And the restraint.
And now you have the opportunity 21st century technology, data surveys, customer participation surveys, to really refine the R3 effort to maximize your success. That's amazing that the continuity of that effort over these generations.
Yeah, I always feel like we are still managing in the footsteps of giants like Aldo Leopold. We haven't diverted very far from that same model. We're still carrying forward those ideals, those principles. The industry is, and should hang their head high. They are still, perpetuating that model of conservation. And, there's a lot of things you can say that's important, but one of the things that continues to happen is the industry helps connect people to nature, people to the great outdoors, whether it's hunting, fishing, shooting, sports, camping, boating, all those things. The industry is heavily involved in continuing to make that connection. And so it's at the end of the day, it's like everything else. It's a partnership. This is perhaps one of the largest partnerships in the world, as far as I'm concerned. And what happens to one happens to everybody, and the good is the good and the bad is the bad, but it's everybody's working together towards some of these common goals. And at the end of the day, it's conservation, and it's getting people outdoors and connecting them to nature and connecting them to these activities, and it's good for all of us when that happens.
So this has been fascinating. I love these sorts of topics because you guys are on the ground getting things done, and but we do have to wrap up. So I have a wrap up question for both of you. Jeff, being one of the elders of the R3 movement,
making me feel old.
25 years of R3 before R3 was a thing.
You guys can't
He started in kindergarten.
Yeah,
my cane is over there. Nobody can see it. It's up by the door.
And of course, Scott here, who chairs the R3 committee for the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is the conference we're at right now. That's the reason we're not in our usual studio setting. But he's chaired that for 3 or 4 years now, I think. So you both are on the cutting edge of R3, especially in the West, because your states are there and you work a lot. I know you're in the Midwest as well. But so what do both of you, what do you see as the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity to R3 going forward and in the short term, next 5 years? What, from all the things you've seen, because you do have the most active. I was in your committee earlier. There's 50 people in there. You go to some of the other regions, they're smaller regions, but if you can get 10, 12 people in a room, you're doing good. And you usually have a 2-day meeting or a day and a half meeting with 50 to 75 people. So you're doing something right. So what's the biggest challenge and what's the biggest opportunity you think in the next 5 years for R3?
That's a tough one. I can start if you'd like.
I was hoping you'd go first.
One of the things that I see is we've harped on this already in the podcast, but R3 and what Scott and I do in the timeline of the Fish and Wildlife Agency, this is a blurb. I mean, this is a small blurb compared to all the incredible things State Fish and Wildlife Agency has done for big game management recovery, waterfowl management recovery, upland game management recovery, fisheries management recovery. The turn of the century was bleak, right? I mean, ugly, bleak when it came to wildlife. And State Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the partnership with the with industry and utilizing trained professional biologists and game wardens and whatnot brought these creatures back from the brink of extinction. I mean, they were at the brink of extinction in a lot of states. And so, one of the greatest success stories ever. And that is ingrained within Fish and Wildlife Agencies over the last, 70, 80 years. They're structured to do that. And all of a sudden comes this R3 movement, right? And it's like all of a sudden now we got these people who they think a little differently. Some of them don't have the same heritage that some of the folks that have been in Fish and Wildlife Agencies for the last 40, 50 years. And believe me, there's a lot of folks been here 40, 50 years. They're still working. You live in Fish and Wildlife Agencies in the conservation world community. You love it. And so, they don't maybe think the same way. They're not tempered maybe the same way, whatever the case may be. And I think that's become a struggle. We've got this robust R3 effort moving forward, but we really haven't come to grip, in my opinion, with structurally where R3 fits within the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, and in reality, what is it going to take to meet the objectives that we might set for ourselves in well developed R3 plans. That I think is going to be something that leaders with State Fish and Wildlife Agencies over the next couple of years, and it's going to have to happen quick, I think, are going to have to deal with. Where does this R3 effort belong, and how is it permeate throughout the entire culture of the agency, so that it's in some way it has to be everybody's job, but on the same token, it has to be coordinated and led somehow. Deer management, wildlife management, it's everybody's job to some degree, but at the same token, there's got to be leadership that has the science, the backing, the understanding, the knowledge, the skills to manage those efforts. And so that's a growth struggle, if you will, but it's not an uncommon growth struggle. It's just something we'll have to figure out as we go. And given how robustly the R3 movement has grown and how successful it's been over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, I think they'll figure it out. I think they'll achieve that over the next couple of years, and it'll start to become obvious.
Gosh, how do you follow that? I
thought about this for a while.
Maybe he did a challenge. What about an opportunity?
The big thing I've been beating on for a long time is scale. And it's similar to what he just identified, but I want to hit it on a different angle. And part of it is the attention span of all of the industry. We all have to be on every single day. I worked for some Fortune 100 companies. We never got 100% of the customer base. Amazon, look at Amazon today. We could all order something on the phone right now. It'll beat us home. They don't have everybody, right? But we have to have everybody, because the people who are participating in outdoor recreation are a small minority of the general public. The vast majority of the American public support legal, regulated hunting. You got to remind them that it's legal and regulated. But so we have to have a society that always values these resources, right? And so we have to figure out how to communicate these messages, and those who want to participate in the recreation facilitate that journey on a scale that we're still operating in the hundreds and the thousands. We need to be operating in the tens to hundreds of thousands to keep up with the population growth in America. That's daunting, right? And so the success that we've seen has come from collaboration. I mean, I'm in Arizona, he's in Nebraska, you're in Kentucky. We collaborate regularly, right? And we do it selflessly. And there's a lot of commercial partners. There's a lot of nonprofit partners that collaborate non-selfishly, generously, to come together to achieve that skill, because no one of us can. So being able to put the pride of our personal brand in the back seat to make sure that the greater cause is always served to achieve that scale, to me, and I think we're winning that. I mean, we've really come so far just in the 10 years I've been here that I think we're on that track. But it's a job that's never going to be done, because little boys and girls turn 10 years old every single day, right? That story has to be told. That story has to be told every single day.
Right.
That's good. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. The scalability is we're figuring it out now, and that'll get better, I'm sure. But that's certainly something that has to be continually monitored and advanced upon. I want to add two other things to this, because I think they're very important. Number one, our hunters and our anglers, the Orange Army and the Blue Army, have got to get more involved in this effort, and they are at all kinds of levels. But every hunter, every angler has to see their role in making sure that there's other new hunters coming behind them, that there's going to be people replace them when they leave, not just because it's a recreational activity and they enjoy it. That's important too, but because the model of conservation in the United States demands it. That's how it's paid for. It has to happen. And so our hunters and our anglers have to be more involved. We have to do a better job of informing them of what's going on, and then they have to be willing to be more part of the solution. And we're starting to see more of that, but we have to continue down that road at a better scale. And the second thing is we've got to continue to make hunting and fishing and shooting sports. We got to broaden the tent, so to speak, right? We got to bring more people in, and this is an uncomfortable thing for some people. This is a heritage-based ideology, and But we have to understand that not everybody has our heritage, right? Not everybody looks at the outdoors and thinks of it as a safe, fun place that I just can't wait to run to. And so but we've got to be more willing as hunters and anglers and shooting sports enthusiasts to welcome people in. In case in point, women and African Americans have been the single greatest increase in firearm purchases and shooting activities over the last 5 years. That's huge. That's incredibly felt across the industry. But we've got to all do a better job of welcoming new participants, new cultures, new backgrounds, new ideologies, and recognize they don't all have the same background, same heritage we do when we do that. And that's going to continue to be a growth element for us, but something that's also going to continue to be something we struggle with until we all get behind that ideology that, hey, the outdoors is good for everybody.
Well, and you said the outdoors are owned by the American citizens, so they're open for everybody, right?
Well, guys, this has been fascinating. We got to wrap it up, but thank y'all for both coming. I got to say this: you're both unicorns in my eyes, and I'm gonna tell you why. You know, you got Jeff here who doing R3 for 25 years as I say a reformed biologist, because that was what agencies first started doing, is repurpose biologists to become R3.
I never acted as a biologist. I was just trained.
Well,
I never had a job.
But the funny thing is that 9 out of 10 biologists they're not extroverts. They don't like to talk, and I'm one too. Don't like to talk to people. I happen to like to do that too. But for the most part, they don't really make the best, in general, the R3 coordinators, because it takes a different mindset, a different mentality. But you're one of the ones that succeeded and a leader in the field. And then Scott leaves a Fortune 100 company and takes a chance as a trained, he's trained in that area. He's not a trained biologist. He's more of a marketing and outreach kind of guy who's worked for the private sector, and he goes to a government agency, probably making a lot less than he did working for industry, and he brings that skill set that's what agencies needed to do. And now Arizona and Nebraska are leaders in recruitment because of the work y'all have done. So you're both unicorns, and we appreciate what you do. Scott, looking forward to hosting more of these with you. And Jeff, we're definitely having you back on. You're awesome, dude.
Love to do it. Love to do it.
Well, we appreciate it. Folks, that's Connecting with Conservation. We'll be back in another week with another show. Thank y'all.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Please do us a favor and tell your buddies, friends, family, and others about what you've learned here today. If you like what you heard, come on back anytime and listen to another episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast.